What I did in the winter of '05 in a small town is something I will never do again. I regret ever having done it, and yet it was perhaps the most interesting time of my life. For a time, I was the essence of delirium. For about a year, I had been smoking pot on a daily basis, and in that time had tried the usual psychoactives: shrooms, acid, salvia, HBWR, and my favourite, ecstasy. So one night, my friend, let's call him Ryan, and I had been planning to get some rolls for about a month now, and had found someone to hook us up. But the day before I got the phone call no parent, or in this case, stoner, ever wants to get, my dealer got tickets to a concert at the last minute and was out of state. We tried to call around everyone we had ever met to find a hookup, but to no avail. So we started walking down the street to our local restaurant, and along the way I noticed a white trumpet-shaped flower growing in some bushes on the side of the road. Ryan and I both identified it as Datura, and decided to snap a pod off of one. We went to the restaurant and I decided to eat 10 seeds. Since we didn't know what it would do to us, I decided to take them and Ryan would be my sitter. We finished our food and walked home. As soon as we got back to my house, I started feeling very paranoid. We went into the living room and started watching the movie Groundhog Day, and as we watched I kept forgetting that Ryan was there, and would become scared and leave the room every time I looked at him. I went into the kitchen and started pouring water into a glass, but started to notice things about my kitchen that I hadn't noticed before. There were spider webs in the corners of the ceiling, and the floor was split in the centre. I screamed and ran into the living room, where Ryan had finished watching the movie, and asked if he could smoke in here. I said he could and curled up under some covers on my couch. About 3 minutes later I took the covers off of my face, and noticed Ryan pulling a cigarette out of his pocket and asking if I had a lighter. I picked one up off of the floor sitting next to me and handed it to him. However, when I asked for it back, he said he had thrown it at me. I didn't think anything of it, knowing that I could find it later, but soon Ryan's cigarette fell out of his hand. I told Ryan that he had dropped it on his lap, and he freaked out. It began rolling on the ground, and before he could roll over the cigarette, it disappeared. I suddenly remembered I had taken Datura, and asked Ryan if he had. He said that he had eaten 12 seeds without telling me. I realised we had shared an illusion, and got extremely frightened. I ran up my stairs, which seemed to go on forever, and every time I tried to get to the top step, it would slide out from under me. I finally gave up, but managed to somehow slide to the top of the stairs. I got up and ran into my bedroom, and fell down on the floor. I slowly got up, and then suddenly I realised that I was in my room with my old friend from high school. Let's call him Bobby. I started reminiscing with him about the crazy times we had, and I started to roll a joint. I started to light it up, and Bobby said we should go out onto the roof to smoke it. We went out my window and sat on the roof and started hitting what would now become a bong. Then, as he passed it to me, it suddenly dropped off the roof, and I leaned into the gutter to try to catch it. Before I managed to completely fall off, luckily, I blacked out. I was woken up 3 hours later by police sirens as the police pulled into the front of my yard. I stumbled into the window and ran out of my room to find Ryan. I ran down the stairs and saw him passed out in the bathroom, in the bathtub with his wrists bleeding. I smashed the mirror in my bathroom with my fist for some reason and ran out the back door and into the cornfield in the back of my yard. I kept running through the stalks until I got to the deepest, darkest spot in the forest of corn. I knelt down to hide from the police, but I kept hearing dogs barking and could see distant stalks moving. I started crying into my hands, and when I removed them, Ryan was there with me. He told me to run with him to the distant caves, and I ran with him. But we were in a jungle now. This shit was weird. I woke up in my backyard about 2 hours later, underneath a wheelbarrow. I went inside and found Ryan not to be there, and I was still tripping. I realised that my life was like Groundhog Day, and that I could kill myself and come back the next day. So I ran my head into the wall 3 times and lost consciousness. I awoke again in an alley outside of the restaurant. How did I get here? The next thing I remember is walking home and seeing some very frightening faces along the sides of the road. I walked into a parking lot next to my house and leaned up against an SUV and passed out. The next thing I remember, I was in the SUV, flying down the highway. I had gotten into the car somehow and started it and began seeing vampires flying around the car. I slammed on the brakes and ran into the woods nearby, pursued by the same vampires, and clawed at a tree until my fingers bled, and sat there shivering, hallucinating, until sleep reclaimed me. I woke up and began walking back to the highway. It took about 15 minutes to get there, but it didn't seem like I had run that far into it. I got into the SUV and drove around the highways for an hour and a half before finding my way back home. When I got home, Ryan was not there. I was far too worried to search for him, so I slept for 10 hours to escape the terrible feeling Datura was giving me. The next day I felt like shit, and called around to find out if anyone knew where Ryan was. It turns out that Ryan was in the hospital with his spine cracked, after having been found by my neighbour. Apparently the cops had never showed up. Indecently, there was no cornfield in my backyard. My gutter was hanging off of my roof, and my house was a mess. The owners of the SUV reported the car stolen, and even though I returned it and explained, they still insisted on pressing charges, and now I'm going on trial for car theft. So basically, Datura kind of fucked my life up, and I never plan on doing it again. Well, if that isn't the best Datura repellent I've ever read in my life, then I don't know what is. Seriously, stay away from this mad shit.